sickness, and all of these other things. Almost every ailment that mankind suffers from is due to the fact that people have repressed anger. So one of the things that I learned is that when you have reasons to be angry, find a way to express it and learn to forgive. And one of the biggest problems I had was I had to forgive the German people for what they did to my family. We lost 39 members of our family. I don't have any cousins or uncles or aunts or anything like what you have. And that was a very important thing to me, to have my own family. But that creates obviously a lot of anger. And so by learning to forgive, you grow and you are able to go beyond that. If you get stuck in your anger, it gets you bitter, it gets you negative, it makes you depressed, and your whole life goes on a downward trajectory. So I want to encourage you all to understand the principle. Now, here are a couple of rules that will help you in dealing with people. Let's assume that somebody says something unkind to you. The thing that you want to do in your mind is learn to control your thinking and learn to control your emotion. So let's say that somebody says to you something that's unkind, maybe not very flattering. It doesn't matter whether they meant to hurt you or whether they meant to help you by pointing something out. The important thing you want to say to yourself, and this is a principle developed by a guy named Weatherhill, and he said, the first thing you want to ask yourself, is it true? If I say something to you, instead of getting mad or getting angry or getting hurt, you want to ask yourself, is it true? If it's true, then you should fix it, because you have an opportunity to correct a flaw in yourself. If it's not true, why get upset? So if you learn to start thinking about processing emotions and processing feeling, you can prevent yourself from getting upset, from building up this anger within you, and so forth. And so there's a very important principle to learn about that. Now, the next thing I want to talk with you about is the fact that in life, everybody has to take a chance, and everybody has to take a risk. My mother was an incredible businesswoman, and when she got to Auschwitz, it didn't take her very long to figure out how to make things work. So what she did is that whenever anybody got to Auschwitz, they always had a job. Some people had to sew clothes, some people had to work on an airfield, some people at a munition factory, other people had to repair shoes. There was all kinds of different work being done. So she got together with different people who worked in different places, and they all excuse me, smuggled things out or took things away. And she was able to get some nice clothes, and she would go up to some of the guards and ask them, do you have a girlfriend? Do you have a wife? And they said yes, and they say, I can get you some nice clothes for your wife, and even jewelry and diamonds and all of these other kind of things. And so it wasn't very long before she actually had a business going in Auschwitz where she was buying and selling things for people. And so if somebody could smuggle out some jewelry, then she would be able to take that jewelry and trade it with guards, and they would get food or medicine or different things like that. And my dad tells a story that one day him and his friend just got back from a work party. They'd worked 12 hours in the snow. They were very tired, fatigued. They were really down. And there was a guard. They were sitting in the corner there, and the guard kept looking at him. And he said to his friend, don't look now, but this guard is looking at us. Well, whenever a guard is looking at you, it was never good news. You were either going to go on another work party, or you were going to go into the gas chamber, you were going to get a beating, but nothing good ever came when a guard was after you. So he just kept his head down, and the guard came up to him and he said, is your name Hugo? And my dad says, yes. And he said, he opens up his briefcase and he hands him a package. And my dad looks at the package and he says, what is this? He says, this is a package from your wife. And he says, my wife? He says, your wife's name's Manya, right? He says, yes. He says, well, she had me deliver this food to you. And my dad says he was just shocked. He didn't know what to think. He thought maybe it was a setup, a joke or something. Anyway, he took the food, And he asked the guard, so the guard says, "What's your Hebrew name?" And he said, "My Hebrew name is Chaim." He said, "Okay." And he says, "Do you mind if I could ask you why you need my Hebrew name?" He says, "Oh, your wife doesn't pay us until we prove that we've delivered the merchandise." So she was running a real operation there. She had all these guards running around doing things for her. And she was able to get by and do things that were just unbelievable. So I talked to her about that one time, and she said, I said, "Wasn't that a big risk?" She says, "Oh yeah, it was a big risk. If you get caught, you know, you're dead." And I said, "Well, how do you know which guard to buy off?" She says, "Well, you have to be very careful. You have to study them." She said, "What I did is I made sure that it wasn't a young, gung-ho guys that were really proud of their uniform and really were great, excited to be Germans. There were guys who were a little tired. They didn't shine their boots as well. They had a little pot belly. They didn't look like they were too excited about being there. Sometimes they showed a little kindness to the prisoners. So I figured this is a person that I could take a chance with." Well, there was a lot of people who wouldn't do that. They wouldn't take that chance. And so my mom always said, in life, you got to take a risk. If you want to get somewhere, if you want to achieve something, nothing is ever certain. But she said, here's the thing that you learned. If you didn't take a risk, you would have died from starvation because you couldn't live on that little piece of bread and that little bit of water. And so if those people who never took a chance, they died because they didn't take a chance. So in life, you have to learn that in order to get ahead, in order to go ahead, you sometimes have to take a risk. It has to be a well thought out risk. It has to be a calculated risk. But you have to take a risk, and that's a very important thing that she taught me in life, that you have to take that risk. And most of the time, if you take the risk, it all works out, and it did in her cases. One of her friends was telling me a story that they were marching down in the snow, and there were a few carrots sticking out of the ground. And so there was a woman guard who was watching them, and she thought that she was around the corner, so my mom jumped out of line and went to grab the carrots, but the guard caught her because out of the corner of her eye she could see her, and she made her get on the knees and hold her hands up. She grabbed the board and hit her across the face, hit her so hard she had to spit out 2 teeth. And then they went on. So she says the next day, she told her girlfriend, "We're going to get those carrots." And she says, "Manya, you're crazy. You saw what happened to you yesterday." She says, "I'm going to wait until she gets around the corner this time." So she went around the corner. She went out and got the carrots. And so they had a little bit more for lunch that day. But that's the kind of thing that you have to do in order to survive and take a risk. There's another story I want to tell about my mom, then we'll move on to my dad. My mom was telling me I was going to go visit Holland in the 70s, and she said there's a lady there by the name of Leni Honstrecht, and she was a girlfriend of mine in concentration camp, and if you go to Holland, I'd like you to look her up and say hello for me. I said, sure. So I called her up and I told her I'm Manya's son, and she said, "Oh my God, you got to come down." And you know, she treated me really like a celebrity, and I thought, geez. So she said, "Did your mom ever tell you how she saved my life?" And I said, "No, I didn't know she did." She says, "Oh my God, you got to hear this story." So she sits me down and she says, "I was dying from typhus." That's a disease, and so what they do is if you're dying from typhus, they put you in a corner in a barrack. They don't let anybody get there because you can contaminate the camp. So there was a guard in front of the barracks, and she said she was laying there and she was kind of delirium. She didn't know whether she was dreaming but she thought she heard my mom's voice. So all of a sudden my mom comes in, she's got a big smile, she's carrying some food and water and a nightgown, and she says, "Manya, what are you doing here? If they catch you in here, they can shoot you." She says, "Don't worry about it. I talked to the guard." And she said, "Was that you? I thought I heard your voice." She says, "Yeah, I was talking to the guard." She says, "What did he say?" And he says, "Well," he says, he was pointing the gun at me. He says, "If you go any further, I'm going to shoot you." And she said, let me ask you a question. Do you have a family? And he says, yeah. He says, if your family member was dying in there, wouldn't you want to go in there? And he said, yes. But if you go in there, my orders are to shoot you, and I will. She said, well, you know, she said, I'm in line to go into the gas chamber. What they do is, as they're moving people in the gas chamber, you go from one barrack, and then when they gas that people in the front barracks, they move you into the next barracks. So she figured she'd be in the gas chamber in about 2 weeks at the rate they were going. She says, I'm going to be in the gas chamber in about 2 weeks, or I'm going to go in there and visit my girlfriend, and you're going to shoot me. One way or another, I'm going to go in. So she walked in, and he didn't shoot her. So I was just dumbfounded. I couldn't believe that she would do that. So when I got home, I said, Ma, Lainey was telling me this story. She says, oh, yeah. I said, what were you thinking? She said, well, you know, I have very good intuition. And I looked into his eyes, and I knew that he wouldn't shoot me. And that made sense. And then I thought, I said, but Ma, what would have happened if you'd have been wrong? She started laughing. She said, well, then I'd be dead. So that was the kind of woman she was. Very strong, very courageous, very difficult to grow up underneath, I can tell you that. But anyway, so this went on. My folks were there for about 15 months, and my dad was ready to go on to another death march. They were moving the camp again, and he didn't have any shoes. He was that much weaker, and a friend of his was there, and he said, Hugo, you're not going to make it on the next march. And his friend was dying there, and he said they had left a number of people there on straw. They were just going to let him die as they were moving the camp out. And so my dad says, you know what, I think you're right. I think I'm going to hide underneath the straw, and I'm going to stay with you. We'll stay together. And so he hid underneath the straw. So they tattoo everybody with a number, and they take rolls. So they were taking roll before they left the camp. And they found out that one number was missing. My dad's number was missing. So they said, Such the barrack, that means search the barrack. So he says he's laying there, and he hears the guards' boots running, coming into the barracks. And he said he was laying there, and they were putting their bayonets in it, looking to see if anybody was hiding. He said he was laying there, and the bayonet was coming here, and it was coming there. And he said one of them almost hit him right in the head. But he said they didn't hit him, and so they left. So they reported to the top guy, and he said, search him again. So he said, oh my God, they're coming again. He said, he's never going to make it. But anyway, went through it again. He said it came real close, but it never hit him. And so he was finally relieved. They all left. And he said that his friend said that once all the guards were gone, he would let my dad know. Well, my dad's friend passed out, became unconscious, so my dad laid there for a day and a half because he was afraid to move, because if his friend didn't say anything, he figured the guards would still be there. But finally, one day he woke up and he heard a bunch of shooting, and he heard somebody say, brothers, we are free. Well, the American Army, the Third Army, invaded Auschwitz, and they liberated my dad's camp. And so my dad was saved at the last moment. He was so weak that he couldn't walk by himself. Him and his friend had to hold each other up, and that's how they walked. But anyway, they went to the Americans took him to the hospital and got him back to health, and he came back to Holland. So he came back to Holland, and when he came back to Holland, he went to the Red Cross, because this is how you find your relatives. So you'd go in and sign your name, and then your relatives could go and find him. So so my mom got out of concentration camp first. She went to the Red Cross, and she was looking for all of her family's name, and nobody showed up. So she figured they all died, including my dad, so she didn't put her name down. So then when my dad got there, he looked for her name, and he couldn't find anybody's name. So he didn't think that she survived. So he was walking down the street one time, and there was a milkman going up the street, and he was pushing this cart, and he was kind of an old man, and he did it with a bicycle, and so he was pushing it up a hill. So he went to help, and he pushed up, and he looked at the guy, and it turns out to be his old milkman. And they shook hands and hugged and said, boy, he says, you know, Hugo, it is so wonderful to see that both you and your wife survived Auschwitz. That's just amazing. And my dad says, no, I'm sorry to tell you, my wife didn't make it. And he says, oh, yes, she did. I just saw her yesterday. And my dad was just shocked. He says, you saw her? Yes, she's living right up the street. So he said that the Americans had given him a few dollars, and he went and bought some flowers and knocked on the door. And that's where my mom was, so they got together after that. And then they came and picked me up. And so I was at the orphanage, and you know, I saw these two people coming up the driveway. And what we used to do is all the kids, when they'd see parents coming up, sometimes it'd be one, sometimes it'd be a couple, all the kids would run because they were hoping it was their parents. Well, I used to run there all the time, but it was never my parents, so I just never bothered going. So I was sitting there with this little girl out there, and she says, you know, Arnold, I heard the people talking. They said, those people are your parents. And I looked at them and I said, nah. She says, no, I heard that they were talking, that those were Arnold's parents. So I just thought it was too good to believe. And I was just sitting there, and all of a sudden says, Arnold, come on in. And she goes, see, I told you. So I go in there. I was very weak also. I could barely walk. Most of the time I crawled. I was about 6 at that time. And anyway, my dad looks at me and tells the lady, that's not my son. And I go, oh. And because when he dropped me off, I was much bigger and I was much heavier, and so he didn't recognize me. So my mom looked at me for 1 second. She says, that's Arnold. That's it. So anyway, they picked me up, and that night, when my dad went to take me to bed, I asked him if he would lift me up so I could turn off the light. And apparently before the war, I didn't even remember this, but he said that he used to lift me up, and I'd sing a little song to the sun, good night, son, and then I'd turn the light switch off. So when I asked him to do that, he said that he knew then that I was his son. Anyway, I wanted to share a couple of other thoughts with you on life and how it works with regard to getting ahead. The most important thing in life is always, irrespective of what happens, to always look at the positive side of things, and most important, to look at suffering as a way of learning. When you suffer, you learn things that you could never learn any other way. So suffering is a way in which we learn the important lessons of life. And forgiveness is one of the most important things, but I came to the conclusion that the greatest lesson of them all is the lesson that I learned through many different ways. And I want to give you one because it's probably the most profound lesson of life. And that is, there was a psychiatrist in Auschwitz by the name of Dr. Frankl. And he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. And what he came to the conclusion is that people could withstand suffering if there was a reason attached to it. If you were suffering and you had no reason for it, it's very difficult to put up with. But if you have a reason for living, you can get past the suffering. So Dr. Frankl was a psychiatrist. He took notes during the concentration camp to see how people reacted. And one of the things that he said was one of the most profound experiences that he ever had. They were marching along after a work party. They were struggling in the snow. They were slipping. They were getting hit by the guards. They were suffering. They were hungry. They were tired. Their bones ached. It was just one of the most incredibly difficult times of his life. And one of the guys next to him, he said, I sure hope our wives are doing better than we are. Can you imagine if they knew what we were going through? And he had just gotten married. He was only married about 1.5 years, and he said that his mind all of a sudden started switching on his wife. And he started thinking about her, and he said he could visualize her, and he could see her smile, and he could even see himself talking back and forth. And he says in that moments of intense suffering, he got such a feeling of bliss in thinking about the person that he loved. And he said, then, right then and there, a thought hit him, which was the most profound thought that he says, in all poetry, in all of the great thinkers, they've all come to the same conclusion, that the greatest thing that human beings contrive for is to understand love, to be able to receive it, to be able to give it, and to be able to share it. And that is man's highest achievement. And he said that that was the profound lesson that he learned, is that in that incredibly difficult time, that you could actually experience a moment of bliss in contemplation of the people you love. So the greatest lesson of all the things we've covered is the fact that that is the greatest thing to be pursued in a lifetime. And once you pursue that, here is the other beautiful, most optimistic thought of all, that once you experience that, you never lose somebody you love. You may leave them on this plane, you may lose them for a while, and you may miss them while they're gone. But deep down in your heart, in the contemplation of that person, you will never lose them. They will be with you forever. And that is also one of the greatest things. And I want to show you what Anne Frank, if you read her book, you read that this little girl at 13 to 15 years old said, everyone has inside of him a piece of the good news. The good news is that you don't know how great you can be, how much you can love, what you can accomplish, and what your potential is. And I say amen to that, because that's what everybody has in store of them. That's what everybody has the potential. And so from these bitter lessons of suffering, you have a lessons of hope that what you can do with your life is truly extraordinary. Thank you very much for your time. Ask them if they have any questions.
So we're going to open the floor now for any questions. So just raise your hand and he will answer your question.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, be happy to try to answer them for you.
So I'm more interested on how you got interested in hypnosis. Did you undergo that as a child, perhaps?
I didn't hear, can you?
Yeah. So she's asking what got you interested in hypnosis.
Oh, what got me interested in hypnosis is that my dad always talked about that everything in life in concentration camp was mental. In other words, you're down to 85 pounds, you're working on vapor. The only thing that's keeping you alive is your mind, your will to live, the reason you want to survive. And I was going through a very difficult time in depression. I used to have to take a nap at about 3:30 when I was building my business because I was so fatigued from depression. And then I read an article that if you hypnotize yourself, you can sleep for 20 minutes and it's the equivalent of 3 hours sleep. And the way that works is usually when you go to bed at night, you toss and turn for about an hour and a half. Then you go into the deep sleep, somnambulistic sleep. That's the part where you really heal for an hour and a half. Then you kind of come out of it again,